What happens when you stare into a mirror and your reflection stares back, but doesn't move when you do? Johnny Depp was about to find out, and what he discovered would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. The mirror in Johnny's dressing room had witnessed more transformations than any Hollywood makeup artist. Captain Jack Sparrow's wild swagger, the Mad Hatter's chaotic energy, Edward Scissorhands' silent torment. But tonight, as Johnny stood there with his pirate coat hanging loose and black eyeliner smudged beneath exhausted eyes, the mirror reflected something terrifying. A complete stranger. "Cut!" The director's voice boomed across the Caribbean set. But Johnny couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, his breath caught in his throat. The antique mirror they'd used as a prop, the same cursed thing that had followed him through 5 Pirates films, countless interviews, and a lifetime of running from himself, was showing him something impossible. The crew bustled around him like worker ants, striking the set, chattering about weekend plans, completely oblivious to the crisis unfolding 3 feet away. Johnny's reflection wavered in the glass, but not from any camera trick or special effect. This was something else entirely. His face in the mirror looked older, more weathered, as if every character he'd ever played had carved lines into his soul. When had those laugh lines become trenches of pain? When had his eyes started carrying the weight of 1,000 performances, each one taking him further from who he really was? But here's where it gets truly disturbing. As Johnny reached up to touch his face, his reflection didn't move with him. Instead, it tilted its head with an expression of profound sadness and spoke in a voice that wasn't quite his own. "You've been running from yourself for so long, Johnny. You don't even know who you are anymore." The words hit him like ice water in his veins. This wasn't just another role ending, another character being stripped away. This was the moment when 40 years of hiding behind masks finally caught up with him. The mirror was about to show him everything he'd been desperately trying to avoid, and there was nowhere left to run. But what Johnny saw next in that mirror would make him question everything he thought he knew about his own life. The reflection began to shift and morph, the familiar features dissolving like smoke, reforming into something that made his heart stop cold. It was himself, but not as the world knew him. This was Johnny at 12 years old, standing in his childhood bedrooms in Owensboro, Kentucky, clutching a beat-up guitar with strings that cut his fingers raw. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, not from any monster under the bed, but from the sound of his parents screaming at each other downstairs, their marriage crumbling like old wallpaper. "Do you remember me?" the boy in the mirror whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of forgotten pain. "I'm the kid you left behind when you learned that being someone else was safer than being yourself." Johnny's throat constricted. God, he'd forgotten how small he'd felt back then, how powerless. That kid had dreams that seemed impossible in a town where dreams went to die, to escape the chaos, to find his voice, to become someone who mattered. But somewhere along the twisted path of fame and fortune, that boy had been buried alive, under layers of performance. "I tried to protect you," Johnny whispered to the child in the glass, his voice breaking. "Every character I created, every accent I borrowed, every voice I stole, it was all armor to keep you safe." The boy's reflection flickered like a candle in the wind. But armor becomes a coffin when you forget how to take it off. And Johnny, I've been suffocating in here for 30 years. Suddenly, the mirror erupted into a kaleidoscope of images, flashing through Johnny's life like a broken film projector. His first acting class, where he realized he could disappear into someone else's skin. The intoxicating moment he became Edward Scissorhands and felt the relief of not having to be himself. The day Jack Sparrow's swagger gave him confidence he'd never possessed. As plain old Johnny Depp, each character had been a hiding place, a refuge from the awkward kid who never felt good enough, smart enough, worthy enough. But now, face to face with that abandoned child, Johnny realized the horrible truth. He'd been running from himself for so long that he'd forgotten there was a self to run back to. The mirror's surface began to ripple like disturbed water, and when it cleared, Johnny saw not just his reflection, but a doorway. And what waited beyond that threshold would challenge everything he thought he knew about identity, authenticity, and the price of fame. What Johnny discovered behind that door would haunt him for the rest of his life and change everything he thought he knew about the man he'd become. His reflection stepped aside like a doorman welcoming him into hell, revealing a seemingly endless corridor lined with mirrors that stretched into darkness. But these weren't ordinary mirrors. Each one pulsed with its own twisted life, and trapped within their frames were the souls of every character Johnny had ever played. "Welcome to your gallery of souls," his reflection announced, now transformed into a grotesque carnival barker, wearing a blood-red ringmaster's coat. Every mask you've worn, every voice you've stolen, every person you've pretended to be, they're all here, and they're all very, very angry. Johnny's legs moved of their own accord, carrying him down the corridor against his will. The air grew thick and oppressive, filled with whispers and accusations from the trapped characters. In the first mirror, Mad Hatter's wild eyes gleamed with malicious glee, his hat tilted at an impossible angle. "You used me," the Hatter cackled, his voice echoing from behind the glass. "You wore my madness like a costume, then discarded me when the cameras stopped rolling. But madness, dear Johnny, has a way of sticking around." The next mirror held Sweeney Todd, his razor gleaming in the dim light. "I gave you my rage," the demon barber snarled, "my pain, my thirst for revenge. You borrowed my darkness and made millions, but you never understood what it cost me to carry that burden." Johnny tried to look away, but his eyes were drawn to the mirror containing Edward Scissorhands. This reflection didn't speak. It simply stared with infinite sadness, those blade-covered hands pressed against the glass. Johnny could feel the crushing loneliness he'd channeled for that role, the isolation of being unable to touch without causing pain. "Each of us gave you everything," Captain Jack Sparrow's reflection called out, his usual swagger replaced by something darker. "We gave you our voices, our mannerisms, our very souls. But what did you give us in return? Nothing but abandonment." The mirrors began to pulse with malevolent energy, and Johnny realized with growing horror that he wasn't just remembering these characters, he was trapped with them. He'd built a prison of borrowed personalities, so complete that he couldn't find his way back to the exit. But at the very end of the corridor, one mirror remained covered by a funeral shroud, and from behind it came a sound that made every character fall silent. The voice of Johnny Depp himself, crying for help. The sound that emerged from behind that shrouded mirror was the most terrifying thing Johnny had ever heard, because it was his own voice, but not as the world knew it. This wasn't Jack Sparrow's theatrical drawl, or the Mad Hatter's whimsical rambling. This was the voice he'd buried so deep that he'd forgotten it existed. The voice of John Christopher Depp, singing soft and uncertain, the way he used to sing as a child, when he thought no one was listening. But here's what made it truly horrifying. The voice was crying for help. Johnny approached the shrouded mirror on trembling legs, his heart hammering against his ribs. The other reflections watched in absolute silence, their borrowed personalities suddenly seeming small and pathetic. Even Captain Jack's eternal smirk had faded into something resembling fear. "Are you ready for this?" his original reflection asked, materializing beside him like a ghost. Because once you see what's behind that cloth, there's no going back. Once you know the truth about who you really are, you can't unknow it. Johnny's hand hovered over the funeral shroud, and he realized his fingers were shaking. He thought about his daughter, Lily Rose, how she looked at him with such pure love, but sometimes seemed to search his face for something real, something authentic. He thought about his son, Jack, named after a pirate, but deserving a father who existed in his own life. "I've been performing since I was 12 years old," Johnny whispered, his voice barely audible. "Even when the cameras weren't rolling, even when I was completely alone, I was still acting. I don't know how to just exist as myself." "That's exactly the point," his reflection replied, and for the first time, there was genuine compassion in its voice. "You've been so busy being extraordinary, so terrified of being ordinary, that you forgot something crucial. Ordinary can be beautiful. Authentic can be enough." The covered mirror began to glow with an otherworldly light, and Johnny knew this was the moment of truth. With one swift motion, he yanked away the shroud, and what he saw made him fall to his knees. The mirror showed nothing, complete emptiness, a void where his true self should have been. But as Johnny stared into that terrifying darkness, something incredible began to happen. The emptiness started to fill with light, not the harsh glare of stage lights or camera flashes, but something warm and gentle. And in that light, he began to see not who he had been, or who he had pretended to be, but who he could become if he had the courage to try. The vision was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, because it meant letting go of everything he'd used to define himself. And as the mirrors around him began to crack and splinter, Johnny realized that choosing authenticity would mean destroying the very foundation of his identity. What happened next would either save Johnny Depp or destroy him completely, and the choice was entirely his. The mirrors began to crack one by one, starting with Jack Sparrow's cocky grin. The sound was deafening, like thunder rolling through his soul. The glass spider-webbed across the pirate's face, distorting those familiar features until they became a grotesque parody of the character that had made him famous. "No, no, no." Johnny lunged forward, pressing his hands against the fractured glass, trying desperately to hold the pieces together. "These aren't just characters. They're my life's work. They're everything I am." But Edward Scissorhands' mirror followed, the cracks spreading like the scars on those artificial hands. The sound of breaking glass filled the air like a symphony of destruction, and with each shattered reflection, Johnny felt a piece of his identity crumbling away. "Did they make you who you are?" his reflection asked, now appearing as the most ordinary version of himself. A simple man in faded jeans and a worn t-shirt, no makeup, no costume, no pretense. Or did they prevent you from becoming who you were meant to be? The Mad Hatter's mirror exploded in a shower of colorful glass, each shard reflecting a different moment of madness Johnny had embraced to avoid the clarity of being himself. The laughter that had once seemed so charming now sounded hollow and desperate, echoing off the walls of the crumbling corridor. "I won't let them go," Johnny cried, falling to his knees in the sea of broken glass, his hands bleeding as he tried to gather the pieces. "Without these characters, I'm nothing. I'm just John Christopher Depp from Kentucky, the high school dropout who couldn't keep his parents together, who never felt like he belonged anywhere." But even as he spoke the words, Johnny realized something profound was happening. The glass wasn't just breaking, it was dissolving, turning into silver dust that swirled around him like a gentle snowfall. And with each character that disappeared, he felt not emptiness, but a strange sense of relief. "What's wrong with that person?" his ordinary reflection asked, kneeling beside him in the ruins of his false identities. What's wrong with being human? What's wrong with being flawed, searching, uncertain? What's wrong with being enough, just as you are? For the first time in decades, Johnny was crying, not as a character processing grief for a scene, but as a man who had spent his entire adult life running from his own heart. The tears were real, unscripted, and they fell onto the silver dust like rain on fertile soil. "I'm terrified," he whispered, his voice raw and broken. "I don't know who I am without the masks. I don't know if there's anything left." But as the last of the glass turned to dust, one final mirror appeared, and what it showed him would change everything he thought he knew about love, authenticity, and the courage to be seen. The final mirror that appeared would either save Johnny's soul or break it forever. And what he saw, reflected back at him, was the most powerful force in the universe. This mirror didn't show Johnny as he was, or as he pretended to be, or even as he feared he might become. Instead, it showed him through the eyes of his children. And the love he saw there was so pure, so unconditional, that it nearly brought him to his knees all over again. In Lily Rose's eyes, he wasn't the swashbuckling Captain Jack Sparrow, or the mad, twisted hatter. He was the father who used to read her bedtime stories in funny voices just to make her giggle, who would dance with her in the kitchen while pancakes burned on the stove, who would sit beside her bed during thunderstorms and sing soft lullabies in his real voice, the Kentucky drawl he'd spent years trying to hide. In Jack's eyes, he wasn't a Hollywood icon worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was simply Dad, the man who taught him to play guitar with patient hands, who showed him how to be gentle with stray cats, who promised to always be there, even when movie schedules pulled him to the far corners of the world. "This is who you really are," his reflection said, and for the first time, its voice was filled with warmth instead of accusation. Not the characters you've played, not the personas you've created, but the man you become when you love without performing, when you give without expecting applause. Johnny pressed both palms against this mirror, and unlike all the others, it didn't crack or shatter. Instead, it grew warm under his touch, as if the love his children felt for him was radiating through the glass, like sunlight through a window. "But I failed them," Johnny whispered, his voice breaking. "I was so busy being everyone else that I forgot how to be their father. I missed birthdays, missed school plays, missed the moments that mattered because I was too busy becoming someone else." "You're human," the reflection replied gently. "You made mistakes. You got lost in the maze of your own making. But look at what you see in their eyes. Not disappointment, not resentment, but love. Pure, unconditional love. And every day you wake up is a new chance to choose who you want to be." The broken glass from all the shattered character mirrors began to swirl around Johnny like a silver tornado. But instead of cutting him, each piece seemed to dissolve into stardust. The weight of all those borrowed personalities was lifting from his shoulders, and for the first time in decades, he could breathe. "What happens now?" Johnny asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Now," his reflection said, "you learn the hardest lesson of all. You learn to live without the mirrors. You learn to trust that you're enough, just as you are. You learn that the most courageous thing you can do is show up as yourself." The mirror room began to fade around the edges, reality seeping back in like water through cracks. Johnny found himself back in his dressing room, facing the antique mirror that had started this entire journey. But now it showed only his own face, tired, real, vulnerable, and ready to begin again. But as he turned toward the door, preparing to step back into the world as himself for the first time in decades, he heard footsteps in the hallway and a voice that would test everything he'd just learned about authenticity and courage. The voice that echoed down the hallway would either confirm Johnny's transformation or drag him back into the prison of borrowed identities. And what happened next would determine the rest of his life. Johnny Depp. The director's voice boomed with the kind of manic energy that had once been like a drug to him. Where the hell are you? I've been looking everywhere. I've got the most incredible news. The opportunity of a lifetime. Johnny's hand froze on the dressing room door handle. Just moments ago, he'd been ready to step into the world as himself for the first time in decades. Now, faced with the familiar call of another transformation, he felt the old patterns stirring in his mind like sleeping dragons. The studio just approved the biggest budget we've ever had. The director continued, his footsteps getting closer. I'm talking about a character that will redefine your entire career. A 19th century vampire with a tragic backstory. A British aristocrat with a dark secret. And get this, he's got multiple personalities, each one more fascinating than the last. The old Johnny would have already started thinking about the accent, the walk, the mannerisms. His mind would have begun crafting another elaborate escape from the terrifying reality of just being himself. Even now, he could feel the familiar itch, the seductive pull of disappearing into someone else's skin. Think Interview with a Vampire meets Sweeney Todd meets Jekyll and Hyde, the director said, rounding the corner with wild eyes and gesturing hands. You would literally become 4 different people in one film. The studio's already talking Oscar, Golden Globe, maybe even a whole new franchise. But something was different this time. The silver dust from the shattered mirrors still seemed to shimmer in the air around Johnny, reminding him of the choice he'd made. The voice of his reflection echoed in his mind. The most courageous thing you can do is show up as yourself. Johnny started, then stopped. His reflection in the dressing room mirror seemed to nod encouragingly, no longer showing a stranger, but simply showing him. Flawed, uncertain, but real. I need to think about it, Johnny said finally, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. The director's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, then something approaching panic. Think about it, Johnny, this is a $150 million franchise. This is your comeback after everything that's happened. After all the bad press, all the legal battles, you need this role. Do I? Johnny turned to face him fully, and for the first time in their 10-year working relationship, he wasn't performing. Or do I need to figure out who I am when I'm not becoming someone else? The director stared at him as if he'd announced his intention to quit acting and become a monk. In Hollywood, authenticity was the most foreign concept imaginable, even more rare than genuine talent or original ideas. You're scaring me, man, the director said, his voice dropping to a whisper. This isn't like you. You've never, ever turned down a chance to disappear into a character. It's what you do. It's who you are. Johnny looked back at the mirror one last time, and his reflection was smiling now, not Jack Sparrow's mischievous grin or the Mad Hatter's maniacal smile, but something genuine and peaceful. Maybe, Johnny said quietly, that's exactly the problem. And as he walked past the director toward the exit, ignoring the increasingly desperate calls behind him, Johnny stepped into the most terrifying role of his life, being himself. But the real test was waiting for him just outside those studio doors. What Johnny faced outside those studio doors was like walking into the eye of a hurricane, except this storm was made of camera flashes, shouting voices, and the crushing weight of the world's expectations. The moment his foot touched the pavement, the paparazzi erupted from every corner like a pack of hungry wolves. Cameras clicked with the sound of machine gun fire, and voices screamed over each other in a cacophony that would have sent the old Johnny retreating back to his dressing room. "Johnny, Johnny, give us the Jack Sparrow voice. Do the Mad Hatter walk. Come on, be weird for us. Give us something. Are you having a breakdown? Is it true you're retiring?" The assault was relentless, overwhelming. These vultures had built their careers on capturing Johnny Depp, being anyone except Johnny Depp. They wanted the show, the performance, the carefully crafted eccentricity that had made him famous and kept them in business. But Johnny stood there in the harsh California sun, wearing nothing but jeans and a simple t-shirt, feeling more exposed than he'd ever felt in his life. Without a character to hide behind, without an accent or a costume or a persona, he was just a man blinking in the glare of 1,000 camera flashes. "Come on, Johnny," one photographer shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Give us something, anything. Just be Johnny Depp." The irony hit him like a physical blow. They were asking him to perform, being himself, to turn his own identity into just another character in his repertoire. Even his authenticity was expected to be an act, a carefully choreographed piece of theater for public consumption. The old Johnny would have obliged. He would have slipped into some variation of his public persona. The mysterious artist, the quirky outsider, the unpredictable genius. The cameras loved his eccentricity because it gave them something to sell, something to dissect, something to turn into tabloid gold. But now, standing in the eye of this media storm, Johnny felt something he'd never experienced before: the power of simply being present. He raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent, expecting some vintage Depp weirdness, some quotable moment they could splash across their headlines. Instead, Johnny spoke in his natural voice. No accent, no affectation, just the Kentucky drawl he'd spent decades trying to hide. "I'm just a guy trying to figure out who he is, same as anyone else." The cameras exploded in a frenzy of clicks, but Johnny could see the confusion spreading across the photographers' faces, like a virus. This wasn't the Johnny Depp they knew how to package and sell. This wasn't the character they'd built their paychecks on capturing. "That's not enough," someone screamed from the back. "We need more. Give us the real Johnny Depp." Johnny looked out at the sea of desperate faces, all waiting for him to disappear back into performance. The pressure was enormous. It would have been so easy to slip back into the old patterns, to give them what they wanted, to become someone else, just to make them go away. But then he remembered his children's faces in the mirror, the way they looked at him with love that wasn't conditional on his ability to entertain or amaze or perform. "This is all I have," Johnny said simply, and started walking toward his car. The crowd followed like a swarm of locusts, but with each step, Johnny felt something extraordinary happening. He was learning the most radical lesson of his life: that being enough, just as he was the most courageous act he could perform. But as he reached his car, he saw someone waiting for him, who would challenge everything he thought he'd learned about authenticity, love, and the courage to be real. Leaning against Johnny's car was the one person whose opinion mattered more than all the critics, directors, and paparazzi combined. And what she was about to say would either validate his transformation or shatter his newfound resolve completely. Lily Rose stood there with tears streaming down her face, her arms wrapped around herself, like she was trying to hold the pieces together. She'd been waiting for him, and Johnny realized with a crushing weight in his chest that this was the most important mirror of all. The one that reflected not who he pretended to be in movies, but who he actually was as a father. "Dad?" Her voice cracked like thin ice, small and vulnerable, in a way that made every protective instinct in Johnny's body scream. "Are you okay? People are saying you're having some kind of breakdown. The internet is going crazy with videos of you acting normal." The word normal hit Johnny like a punch to the gut. Even his daughter wasn't sure if authenticity was a good thing or a sign of mental collapse. He'd performed for so long that being real seemed like the abnormal choice. "No, baby," Johnny said, pulling her into his arms and feeling her trembling against his chest. "I'm not having a breakdown. For the first time in my life, I'm actually having a breakthrough." "But I was scared," she whispered into his shirt, her words muffled but clear. "I thought you were going to disappear again, not into a role this time, but just disappear completely. Like maybe you'd realize there was nothing left underneath all the characters." The words cut deeper than any harsh review or tabloid headline ever could. His daughter had spent her entire life watching him vanish into other people's skins, and now she was terrified that without those borrowed identities, there might be nothing left of her father at all. "I'm not going anywhere," Johnny said, pulling back to look directly into her eyes, eyes that held his own fear reflected back at him. "I promised you, Lily. For the first time in decades, I'm actually going to be here. Really, truly here." "But what about your career?" she asked, and Johnny could hear the confusion in her voice. "What about the movies? You love acting. You love becoming other people. It's who you are." Johnny glanced back at the studio buildings looming behind them, then at the paparazzi still lurking at the edges of the parking lot, like hungry vultures, then back at his daughter's worried face. The choice had never been clearer or more terrifying. "I'll still make movies," he said, and he could feel the truth of it settling into his bones. "But I won't disappear into them anymore. I'll bring myself to the characters instead of letting them replace me. I'll act, but I won't vanish." Lily Rose studied his face with the intensity of a detective examining evidence, and Johnny realized she was looking for something specific, some sign of the father she remembered from her childhood, before fame had built walls around him that even love couldn't always penetrate. "You look different," she said finally, her voice filled with wonder. "Your eyes. It's like you're actually looking at me instead of through me. Like you're present instead of just visiting." "I am present," Johnny said, and the words felt like the most honest thing he'd said in 40 years. "And I'm sorry it took me so long to figure out how to be here with you." They stood there in the parking lot, father and daughter, while the world waited for Johnny Depp to perform, being Johnny Depp. But for the first time in decades, he was just being dad, flawed, learning, but real. "Want to get some coffee?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the theatrical flourishes that had defined his public persona. "Maybe you can tell me what I've missed while I was busy being other people." As they walked away from the chaos together, Johnny caught his reflection in the car window. The man looking back at him was ordinary, uncertain, and beautifully, courageously real. And for the first time in his life, that was not just enough. It was everything. But the ultimate test of his transformation was yet to come, and it would happen in the most unexpected place of all. 6 months later, Johnny stood before yet another mirror. But this one was different from all the others. This mirror hung in a cramped dressing room in a small, intimate theater in downtown Los Angeles. And what he was about to do would either prove his transformation was real or reveal it as just another elaborate performance. Tonight, Johnny Depp was about to take the stage for his first one-man show. Not as Captain Jack Sparrow or the Mad Hatter, or any other borrowed identity, but as himself, telling his story of losing and finding his identity, of shattering mirrors and discovering truth. The theater was packed, but not with the usual crowd expecting spectacle and eccentricity. These were people who had fought their own battles with authenticity, who had hidden behind masks of success, addiction, perfectionism, or simply the crushing fear of not being enough. They'd come not to see Johnny Depp the movie star, but to hear the story of a man who'd had the courage to become himself. "You ready for this?" his reflection asked. But this time it wasn't a haunted stranger or a carnival barker or any other twisted version of himself. It was just him, nervous, vulnerable, but genuine. "I think so," Johnny replied, adjusting the simple black t-shirt and jeans that had become his uniform. No costume, no makeup, no character to hide behind. "For the first time in my life, I'm going to perform being myself. And that's the most terrifying role I've ever played." The house lights dimmed, and Johnny walked onto the bare stage. A single spotlight followed him, harsh and unforgiving, revealing every line on his face, every imperfection, every sign of the battles he'd fought, and the wisdom he'd earned. The audience fell silent, unsure what to expect from an actor famous for disappearing into other people's skins. "My name is John Christopher Depp," he began, his Kentucky accent soft but clear in the hushed theater. "And for 40 years, I've been running from that name, from that person, from the simple truth of who I am." He told them about the haunted mirror, about the gallery of souls where his characters lived and breathed and demanded their due. He spoke about the moment he chose to let the masks shatter, about discovering that authenticity wasn't about being perfect. It was about being brave enough to be seen. "I spent 4 decades becoming other people because I thought that's what made me special," Johnny continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I could disappear so completely into a character that I forgot there was someone to come back to. But I was wrong. What makes us special isn't our ability to disappear. It's our willingness to be seen, flaws and all." The audience was completely still, hanging on every word. These weren't fans of Johnny Depp the celebrity. They were human beings recognizing their own struggles in his story, their own fears in his confession, their own hope in his transformation. "I still make movies," he said, nearing the end of his 90-minute journey through his own soul. "But now I bring Johnny to the characters, instead of letting them erase Johnny. I've learned that the most powerful performance is the one where you stop performing altogether. The most extraordinary thing you can do is be exactly who you are." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, and saw tears, recognition, understanding. "We all have mirrors that lie to us. They tell us we're not smart enough, not talented enough, not worthy of love just as we are. They whisper that we need to be someone else, someone better, someone more interesting. But here's what I've learned. The person you are when you stop trying to be someone else, that person is magic. That person is enough. That person is worthy of love." As he finished, the applause wasn't the thunderous roar he'd known at movie premieres. It was something deeper, the sound of people recognizing truth, of souls connecting across the darkness. It wasn't applause for a performance. It was gratitude for the courage to be real. Later, as Johnny looked in his dressing room mirror one final time, he saw not a stranger or a character or even an actor, but a father, a man, a human being who had finally learned life's most difficult lesson. The mirror no longer haunted him. It simply reflected the truth, that the most extraordinary performance of his life was the one where he'd stopped performing altogether and started living. And for the first time in 40 years, John Christopher Depp from Kentucky was home.
In a world that constantly asks us to perform, to be more, to be different, Johnny Depp's journey reminds us that authenticity is the ultimate rebellion. We live in an age of social media masks and curated personas where everyone is performing a version of themselves. But true freedom comes when we stop running from who we are and start embracing our beautiful, flawed, ordinary humanity. The mirrors in our lives, whether they're other people's expectations, our own insecurities, or the roles we think we have to play, can become prisons if we let them. But when we have the courage to shatter those false reflections and face the truth of who we are, we discover something remarkable. We were always enough, just as we are. Sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to find yourself at all. And when you do, you realize that the greatest performance of your life is the one where you stop performing altogether.